The first time she slipped her hand into his, it wasn't for love. It was for show. The billionaire in the tailored suit, the woman in the borrowed dress, and the frail, smiling grandmother in the hospital bed who believed every word of the lie they told her. She called them my beautiful couple. She believed they were married. She believed their love was real. And for a while, they almost believed it too. But this wasn't a fairy tale. This was a deal. A deal born in the quiet desperation of a man who had everything money could buy, except the one thing his grandmother wanted to see before she died, his wife. And so, he found one. Not in the boardrooms where he ruled like a king. Not in the glittering halls of the rich and ruthless. But in the most ordinary place, on the most ordinary day, in the most ordinary woman, who would turn his entire life upside down. Her name was Lena Torres. And she didn't just pose as Ethan Cross's wife to comfort his sick grandmom, she made him wish, with every guarded part of his heart, that the lie could be real forever. This is the story of how two strangers became husband and wife, before they ever fell in love. But to understand how they got here, you have to go back to the day the lie began. Ethan Cross was a man whose name opened doors in every city, in every country, in every corner of the world where money ruled. He built towers that touched the sky, carved his signature into skylines, and moved fortunes with a single phone call. People admired him. People feared him. But no one truly knew him. He lived in a world of glass and steel, a penthouse where the walls were clear, but the man inside was anything but. Mornings began with the low hum of a private elevator, the clink of crystal on polished marble, and the cold efficiency of an assistant reciting his schedule down to the minute. Board meetings. Negotiations. Charity galas. Private flights. There was no room in his life for mess, or emotion. Years ago, he'd learned the price of trust. One betrayal had been enough to teach him that opening your heart meant handing someone a weapon. And so, he kept it locked, buried under ambition and power, where no one could reach it. But the call that came that Tuesday afternoon pierced through every layer of armor he'd built. A familiar voice, fragile yet steady, spoke his name, Ethan. It was his grandmother, Helen Cross. The woman who had held his hand at his parents' funeral. The woman who had made sure he had food when the money ran out. The woman who had been his one constant in a world that never stopped shifting. Her words were simple, almost casual, but they struck him like a blow. I want to meet your wife, Ethan. Before it's too late. He froze. Because in all her years of asking, he had never told her the truth, that there was no wife, no love story, no partner waiting for him at home. Instead, years ago, in a moment of weakness, he'd told her a lie. A lie to ease her mind. A lie that had grown into a fantasy she held on to, even now, when her body was failing and time was running out. And as he listened to her voice, thinner than he remembered, a truth heavier than any business deal settled in his chest, he couldn't take that hope away from her. Not now. Not when it might be the only thing keeping her heart beating. That was the moment the plan took root. The moment the lie began to take on flesh and bone. The moment he decided that, for his grandmother, he would find a wife, even if he had to borrow one. He didn't have a name in mind. No face. No plan. Only a deadline that loomed larger with every tick of the clock. His grandmother's condition was worsening, and the doctors were careful with their words, careful enough that Ethan knew the truth was worse than they were saying. He tried to think logically, like he would with any acquisition or crisis. Hire an actress? Too risky. Call in a favor from one of the society women who would have leapt at the chance to be seen on his arm. Even riskier. They would smell opportunity and sink their claws in. He didn't want ambition. He didn't want pretense. He wanted someone safe. Someone who could walk into his grandmother's room and make the lie feel real, not staged. That search, if you could call it that, began on a rainy Thursday. He'd flown in early to the coastal town where Helen lived, trying to keep the visit quiet. A rare day without the suit, just a black sweater, dark jeans, and a cap pulled low. He told himself he was there to see Helen first, but something made him wander into town instead, as if an answer might be waiting for him there. It was the smell that drew him in, coffee and fresh flowers. A small shop on the corner, more blooms than square footage, petals spilling out onto the sidewalk. He stepped inside to escape the drizzle, brushing rain from his sleeves. And that was when he saw her. She wasn't arranging roses like the other shopkeeper. She was arguing, softly but firmly, with an older woman about the price of lilies, insisting the woman take them at half cost because your husband loved these, and that's reason enough. No sales pitch. No performance. Just kindness, given freely. She turned then, meeting Ethan's gaze without hesitation, without recognition, without that flash of calculation he'd grown used to in the eyes of strangers. She looked at him like he was just a man in her shop, dripping rainwater on the floor. "You're blocking the counter," she said, brushing past him to set the lilies in the woman's hands. There was no flirt, no deference, no hint she had any idea who he was. And for reasons he couldn't explain, Ethan felt something rare, the certainty that this woman, whoever she was, could walk into Helen's room and make the lie breathe. Not because she wanted anything from him, but because she seemed to know how to make other people feel seen. Her name, he would soon learn, was Lena Torres. And before the rain stopped falling, he would ask her to become his wife, in name only. It started with small talk, the kind Ethan was never good at. He asked about the flowers. She answered without looking at him, her hands busy stripping leaves from stems, tying them into a neat ribbon. He asked if she owned the shop. She gave a short laugh and said, "Own it? No. I just work here until something better comes along." There was no curiosity in her voice about who he was, no polite attempt to make conversation beyond what was necessary. It was almost disarming. Most people filled silence with nervous chatter in his presence. She seemed comfortable letting the quiet stretch. When she finally glanced up, he caught the quick flicker of appraisal in her eyes, not the kind that measured his net worth, but the kind that sized him up as a person. And whatever she saw didn't seem to impress her. Oddly, he liked that. "You're not from around here," she said flatly. It wasn't a question. "No," he replied. "Just visiting my grandmother." She nodded once, as if that explained everything, and returned to her flowers. He almost left then. Almost. But the image of Helen's smile, the way her voice had sounded on the phone, kept him rooted in place. "I need to ask you something unusual," he said at last. She arched an eyebrow but didn't stop working. "I need someone to pose as my wife. For 2 weeks. It's for my grandmother, she's very ill." Her hand stilled, the scissors hovering over a stem. Slowly, she looked up at him, her eyes narrowing in suspicion. "Is this a joke?" "No," he said evenly. "I'll pay you well. You won't have to lie about much. Just be who you are. But be beside me." For a long moment, she simply studied him, as if weighing whether this was some elaborate scam or a test she didn't understand. Then she set the scissors down. "You're serious?" "Deadly." She crossed her arms. "And what makes you think I'd even consider something like that?" Ethan held her gaze. "Because I've been standing here for 10 minutes watching you treat strangers like family. And I need that." "She needs that." Lena shook her head, a faint, incredulous smile tugging at her lips. "You're insane." "Probably," he said. "But if you say yes, you'll be saving an old woman's last wish." And in that tiny flower shop, with rain tapping against the windows, Lena Torres found herself hesitating, not because of the money, not because of the man, but because something in his voice told her this was more than a favor. It was a plea. She didn't give him an answer right away. Instead, Lena reached for a plain brown paper bag, slipped the bouquet of lilies inside, and handed it to him. "Think about what you're really asking," she said. "Come back tomorrow if you still want to ask it." Ethan took the flowers without argument, a faint trace of surprise in his eyes. People usually said yes to him on the spot, not because they wanted to, but because they were afraid to say no. But this woman, she was making him wait. That night, in the dim glow of his hotel room, he replayed the moment over and over. The firmness in her voice. The unshakable way she'd looked at him, as though she wasn't talking to a billionaire but just a man. It had been years since anyone had done that. And he knew, with an unsettling certainty, that he needed her to say yes. By morning, the rain had cleared, leaving the coastal air sharp with salt and sunlight. Ethan walked back to the flower shop, the bell over the door chiming as he stepped inside. Lena was behind the counter, hair pulled into a loose knot, hands deep in a bucket of tulips. She glanced up, saw him, and set the tulips aside. "Still insane?" she asked. "Completely," he said. "And still asking." She leaned against the counter, folding her arms. "You're not giving me much to go on." Ethan exhaled slowly, choosing his words with care. "Her name is Helen Cross. She's 83. She raised me when no one else would. She thinks I'm married, because I told her I was. I didn't want her to think I was alone. She's in hospice now, and she wants to meet my wife before," his voice caught for the briefest moment. "Before she can't." Something in Lena's expression softened, though her posture stayed guarded. "You want me to lie to a dying woman?" "I want you to make her happy," he said quietly. "Even if it's just for a little while." The silence stretched, heavy and fragile all at once. Then Lena sighed, the fight in her voice dimming. 2 weeks. No more. And I set the terms." Ethan nodded, relief flooding through him though he didn't show it. "Agreed." "And one more thing," she said, stepping out from behind the counter, close enough for him to smell the faint trace of lavender in her hair. "If you try to turn this into something more than what it is, I walk." Understood. What neither of them knew in that moment was that the line she'd drawn so sharply between pretend and real would blur faster than either of them was ready for. The agreement was sealed with nothing more than a nod, but it felt heavier than any contract Ethan had ever signed. Within the hour, Lena had locked up the shop and returned home to change, while Ethan waited outside in the kind of black sedan that drew stares in a town this small. She emerged in a simple navy dress, the fabric modest but flattering, her hair brushed into loose waves. No jewelry except a thin silver bracelet that caught the sunlight when she closed the passenger door. Ethan glanced at her briefly, then looked straight ahead, as if staring too long might reveal something he wasn't ready to feel. The hospice sat on the edge of town, where the air was quiet and the ocean could be heard when the wind shifted. As they walked up the path, Lena's steps slowed. "Tell me what she's like," she murmured. Her voice carried a different tone now, not suspicion, not defiance, but a desire to get this right. "She's stubborn," Ethan said with a faint smile. "Sharp as glass when she wants to be. She used to bake pies for the whole neighborhood. And she doesn't like being lied to." Lena gave him a sidelong glance. "Good thing we're not doing that." The room was warm and sunlit, the scent of lavender drifting from a small diffuser by the bed. Helen Cross sat propped against pillows, her silver hair neatly brushed, her eyes brightening the second she saw Ethan in the doorway. "There's my boy," she said, her voice strong for someone so frail. Ethan crossed to her side, bending to kiss her cheek. "Hi, Grandma." He stepped back, gesturing toward Lena. "There's someone I want you to meet." Helen's gaze shifted, studying Lena with the quick, knowing eyes of a woman who had seen much and missed nothing. Ethan felt his throat tighten. For a split second, he wondered if Helen would see straight through the ruse. But then Helen's face softened into a smile. "So, this is the wife you've been hiding from me." Lena stepped forward without hesitation, taking Helen's hand in both of hers. "I'm sorry it took me so long to get here," she said gently. "But I've been hearing wonderful things about you." Helen chuckled, her eyes crinkling. "And I've been hearing he doesn't deserve you." The laughter that followed was small but real, and in that moment, Ethan saw it, the glow in Helen's cheeks, the ease in her breathing, the happiness that had been missing for months. And though he told himself this was all an act, a seed of doubt began to take root. Maybe, just maybe, it didn't have to be. What was meant to be a short visit stretched on without anyone noticing the time. Helen insisted they stay for tea, her thin hands moving with deliberate care as she poured from a chipped porcelain pot she'd owned for decades. Lena didn't hesitate to sit beside her on the bed, her posture relaxed, her voice low and warm as she asked about Helen's life. Ethan found himself leaning against the wall, silent, watching something he couldn't quite name unfold in front of him. Helen's stories spilled out easily: the house she grew up in, the garden she used to tend, the summer Ethan was 10 and tried to build a treehouse with nothing but scrap wood and stubbornness. Lena laughed in all the right places, asked questions that showed she was listening, and never once glanced at Ethan as if seeking approval for how she was playing her role. When Helen's energy began to wane, Lena reached for the blanket at the foot of the bed and tucked it gently over her legs. "You rest now," she said softly. "We'll be back tomorrow." Tomorrow. Ethan noticed the word, how naturally it had come from her mouth, as if they had already decided to return. Helen's eyes fluttered half-closed, a faint smile on her lips. "You take good care of her, Ethan. She's a keeper." The words caught him off guard. He opened his mouth to reply, but nothing came. Instead, he simply nodded, the weight of the moment pressing into his chest. Outside, the late afternoon sun had turned golden, spilling across the parking lot. They walked in silence until they reached the car. Lena opened her door, then paused, one hand on the roof. "She's remarkable," she said quietly. Ethan looked at her, the corner of his mouth twitching into something that might have been a smile. "Yeah. She is." Lena slid into her seat, and as he joined her on the other side, an unspoken truth settled between them: this was supposed to be pretend. But already, it wasn't feeling that way. The next morning, Ethan told himself it was practical. Returning to see Helen would keep the illusion alive, keep her spirits lifted. That was the reason. Nothing more. But as the day wore on, he found his thoughts drifting. Not just to Helen's face when she'd met Lena, but to Lena herself, sitting there like she'd belonged in that room her whole life. By late afternoon, he was back in front of the flower shop. Lena was inside, sleeves rolled up, arranging sunflowers in a tall vase. She looked up, eyebrows lifting as if to say, "Already?" He didn't bother making an excuse. "She asked about you," he said simply. And that was enough. The second visit felt different. Helen greeted them with more energy than the day before, her eyes darting between the two of them like she was memorizing their faces together. She insisted they join her for the bingo night being held in the common room. Lena hesitated for half a heartbeat, then smiled and agreed. It was a strange sight: Ethan Cross, the man who negotiated billion-dollar contracts, sitting at a folding table under fluorescent lights, holding a flimsy paper card and a dabber pen. Helen sat between him and Lena, calling out his terrible luck with every missed number. Lena laughed so hard she nearly tipped her chair. When it was over, Helen slipped her arm through Ethan's and Lena's, walking them both back to her room. "You know," she said slyly, "most couples would have argued by now. The secret is to keep laughing. That's how you last." Neither of them answered. But later, in the quiet of the car, Lena spoke first. "You're different around her." "She's the one person I can't fake anything with," Ethan admitted. The irony of that truth hung between them, given the lie they were living. And yet, it didn't feel like a lie tonight. Not with Helen's laughter still echoing in his ears, and not with Lena sitting beside him in the dark, her presence as steady as the tide. What he didn't know was that each visit, each shared moment, was pulling them deeper into something neither of them had planned for, a space where pretend began to feel dangerously close to real. The shift was subtle at first. A coffee here, a shared lunch there. Little extensions of their time together that had nothing to do with the hospice visits. Ethan would tell himself it was part of the act, that if anyone saw them in town together, it would make the marriage seem more believable. But deep down, he knew the truth: he was finding reasons to see her. One evening, after leaving Helen's room, he suggested they grab dinner. Lena gave him a cautious look but agreed, on the condition they avoid anywhere too upscale. They ended up in a small seafood diner by the docks, the kind of place where the tables were worn smooth from decades of use and the waitresses knew every regular by name. Ethan ordered whatever she recommended. It was a simple thing, but she noticed, men like him weren't used to letting someone else choose for them. Over fish and chips served in paper baskets, they talked. Not the surface-level conversation they'd been trading before, but pieces of themselves they hadn't meant to share. She told him about the years she spent caring for her younger brother after their parents died, the jobs she'd taken to keep them afloat, the dreams she'd shelved in the process. He told her about the first building he'd ever bought, how it had been less about money and more about proving to himself that he could control something in a world that had taken so much from him. For a while, they forgot the script. There was no pretend wife, no billionaire act, no terminally ill grandmother. Just two people talking over dinner, with the sea wind rattling the windows and the scent of salt lingering in the air. By the time they walked back to the car, the night had grown cold. Ethan draped his coat over her shoulders without thinking, and she didn't give it back right away. Neither of them spoke on the drive home. They didn't need to. The silence had shifted, it wasn't the awkward quiet of strangers anymore. It was the stillness of something beginning to take root. And as much as Ethan told himself this was still just an arrangement, some part of him knew, he didn't want it to end in 2 weeks. It happened 3 days later, on an afternoon that began like any other. Ethan had picked Lena up after her shift at the flower shop, and they were heading toward the hospice with a stop for coffee along the way. The cafe was small, tucked between a bookstore and an antique shop, quiet enough for them to speak without thinking about who might be listening. They were mid-conversation, something about Helen's insistence on teaching Lena her pie crust recipe, when the bell over the cafe door chimed. Ethan didn't notice at first. But then a voice cut through the hum of chatter. "Ethan Cross?" He turned, his expression tightening almost imperceptibly. Standing by the counter was Martin Hale, one of his company's senior investors, a man with a memory like a steel trap and a tongue that loved to gossip in boardrooms. Martin's sharp gaze flicked to Lena, then back to Ethan, the beginnings of a knowing smile forming on his lips. "Didn't expect to see you here," Martin said. "And with company." Ethan kept his tone even. "Lena, this is Martin Hale." "Martin, my wife." The word slipped out smoothly, like it had always belonged there. But Lena felt the weight of it land between them, heavier than it should have been for a lie. She extended her hand, meeting Martin's assessing look without flinching. Martin lingered only a few minutes, but that was enough. By the time he left, Ethan's phone was buzzing with messages, his assistant, his head of PR, even a couple of board members. Someone had already seen a social media post. The headline in his mind was easy to picture: "Reclusive billionaire reveals wife in small-town cafe." Back in the car, Lena studied him. "That man's going to talk, isn't he?" "Yes," Ethan admitted. His grip on the steering wheel tightened. "And once he does, this isn't just between us and Helen anymore." The thought should have unsettled him. It should have made him want to pull back, to protect the boundaries they'd drawn. But instead, he found himself glancing at Lena, wondering why the idea of the world believing she was his wife didn't feel like the worst thing at all. News traveled faster than either of them expected. By the next afternoon, Helen was waiting for them with a mischievous light in her eyes. She didn't even let them sit down before speaking. "So," she said, folding her hands over the blanket in her lap, "I hear you two caused quite a stir at the cafe." Ethan shot a look at Lena, but Helen was already smiling. "Martin's niece works there. She told him she'd never seen you look so at ease, Ethan. And I have to agree. I like it." Lena perched on the edge of the bed, playing along. "It was just coffee, Helen." "Nothing is just coffee when you're in love," Helen replied, her voice tinged with a warmth that made Ethan's chest tighten. "People can feel it. You can't hide it, no matter how hard you try." For a moment, neither of them spoke. Helen's words hovered in the air like they carried a truth neither of them wanted to name out loud. Lena reached for Helen's hand, squeezing gently, and Ethan watched the gesture, small, instinctive, real, and felt the lines of the arrangement blur even further. The rest of the visit passed in a soft haze of conversation. Helen asked them questions about how they'd met, what they liked to do together, even where they saw themselves in 5 years. Lena answered easily, weaving small details into their story that Ethan hadn't heard before, and for reasons he didn't understand, those invented memories began to feel like they could have been real. When they left, the sky was painted in streaks of gold and crimson. Lena walked a step ahead, her hair catching the light, and Ethan found himself wondering what would happen when Helen's time ran out. What excuse would he have to keep seeing her then? And was it really Helen he was worried about, or himself? That question followed him home that night, pressing in on him in the quiet of his penthouse. The next morning, instead of waiting until their usual hospice visit, he called Lena early. His voice was casual, but the invitation wasn't. "Thought you might want to get breakfast before we see Helen." She hesitated long enough for him to almost take it back, but then said, "All right." They met at a little diner on the edge of town, a place with chipped mugs and a menu that hadn't changed in 20 years. Lena ordered pancakes with blueberries, Ethan ordered the same without thinking, surprising them both. The conversation was easy, slipping between teasing and small confessions. Nothing deep enough to be dangerous, but enough to make the hours pass faster than they meant them to. After breakfast, he found himself suggesting a walk along the pier. She agreed, pulling her sweater tighter against the breeze. They strolled past fishermen mending their nets, children tossing bread to gulls, the boards creaking under their steps. At one point, she stopped to watch the horizon, the sea stretching endless and blue. "It's funny," she murmured. "Standing here, it feels like there's nothing in the world except this." He looked at her then, really looked, and realized that for him, in that moment, she was right. By the time they arrived at the hospice later that afternoon, Helen noticed something different. Her eyes flicked between them, the corners of her mouth curving knowingly. But she said nothing, only smiled to herself as they settled in for the visit. That evening, driving Lena home, Ethan caught himself wanting to ask if she'd join him for dinner the next day. Not with Helen, not as part of the act, but just because. He didn't say it. Not yet. But the thought lingered, stubborn and unshakable. And somewhere in the spaces between breakfast, the pier, and that unspoken invitation, the arrangement they had agreed to was quietly becoming something neither of them had signed up for. The call came just after dawn, while the coastal town was still half asleep. Ethan's phone lit up with the name of his head of PR, a woman who rarely called without good reason. Her tone was brisk but edged with urgency. There was a charity gala in the city that night, one of those glittering, heavily photographed events where attendance was less about goodwill and more about being seen. A last-minute sponsor had pulled out, and the organizers were desperate for Ethan's presence. Ordinarily, he would have declined without hesitation. But then came the reminder, the board would be there, key investors, and, most importantly, Martin Hale. The same man who had spotted Ethan and Lena at the cafe. In a matter of days, gossip had likely already spread through corporate corridors. If he arrived alone, questions would multiply. If he arrived with Lena, it would cement the story. By mid-morning, he was at her door. She opened it wearing jeans and a loose t-shirt, hair still damp from a shower. "You're early," she said, narrowing her eyes. "And you look determined." "That's never good." "I need you to come to the city with me tonight," he said. "A charity gala." Black tie. She blinked. "You mean you want me to pretend to be your wife in front of your world now? The real one?" "It's still part of the arrangement," he replied evenly. "And it might keep certain people from digging too deep." Her expression softened into something between irritation and reluctant amusement. "You really are dragging me into the deep end, aren't you?" "I'll make it worth your while," he said, but there was something in his voice that wasn't about money at all. That evening, Lena stepped out of the hotel suite in a deep emerald gown that caught the light like water over glass. Ethan's breath hitched, just slightly, just enough for her to notice before he masked it with a neutral expression. Together, they walked into a ballroom of crystal chandeliers and murmured conversations, every eye turning to follow them. To the crowd, they were the perfect couple. To Helen, if she could see them, they would have looked exactly as she imagined. But to Ethan, it felt dangerously close to something real, something he wasn't sure he could walk away from when the night ended. The moment they stepped into the gala, the air shifted. Conversations softened to murmurs, glances flicked in their direction, and smiles sharpened with curiosity. Ethan was used to it, the silent calculations behind every handshake, but Lena was not. Still, she moved beside him with her chin lifted, her step steady, her arm lightly looped through his as if she'd walked into rooms like this her entire life. They hadn't made it 5 steps before a woman in a diamond collar intercepted them. Veronica Marks, old money, older gossip, and the kind of smile that hid more daggers than warmth. Ethan, she purred, ignoring Lena entirely until Ethan introduced her. Your wife, she repeated slowly, as though tasting the words. How surprising. The sting was subtle, but Lena felt it. She offered a polite smile and a greeting, only to have Veronica's gaze sweep over her gown, her hair, her very presence, with a quiet judgment that needed no words. I suppose you met somewhere, charming, Veronica added, the pause deliberate. Before Lena could reply, Ethan's voice cut in, calm but edged with steel. Yes, he said, his eyes locked on Veronica's. We met in a place where people are real, where kindness isn't currency, and where you learn quickly who's worth your time. The silence that followed was sharp. Veronica's smile faltered before she made a polite excuse to move on. Lena's fingers tightened slightly on Ethan's arm, a silent acknowledgement she wouldn't voice here. As the evening wore on, the pattern repeated, polite introductions masking pointed questions, small talk laced with quiet doubt. And every time, Ethan was there, not just to play the role, but to shield her in ways that didn't feel like part of the script. Later, as they stepped out onto the balcony for air, the city lights stretched below them in a glittering sprawl. Lena turned to him, her voice low. You didn't have to defend me like that. Yes, he said, meeting her gaze. I did. And for the first time since this began, she wondered if the man beside her was defending his pretend wife, or someone he was beginning to see as much more than that. The ride back to the hotel was quiet, but not the strained kind. It was the kind of silence thick with unspoken thoughts, every glance in the rearview mirror catching eyes that quickly turned away. When the car stopped, Ethan stepped out first and offered his hand. Lena hesitated just a fraction before taking it, the warmth of his palm lingering far longer than it should have for 2 people playing a part. Inside the suite, she kicked off her heels with a sigh of relief, leaning against the arm of the sofa. You didn't have to do all that tonight, she said again, softer this time. Half those people will forget my name by morning. Maybe, he replied, loosening his tie, but they'll remember how they treated you. And I'll remember who did. The air between them shifted, heavier now, but not uncomfortable. He crossed the room, stopping just close enough that she could see the faint crease between his brows, the one that appeared when he was thinking too hard. You held your own in there, he said quietly. Better than I expected. Lena's lips curved into a faint smile. And you're better at pretending to be my husband than I expected. He should have laughed, should have taken the out and let the moment dissolve back into safety. But instead, he stayed where he was, searching her face as if looking for the answer to a question he couldn't yet ask. The distance between them felt smaller, and the line they'd drawn at the start of this arrangement, thinner. It was Lena who broke the moment first, brushing past him toward the bedroom. Good night, Ethan, she said over her shoulder, her voice calm but edged with something she didn't want him to hear. He watched her go, every part of him aware that if he followed, something would happen they could never take back. He didn't follow. Not that night. But as he lay awake in the silence, the image of her walking away stayed with him, more vivid than any deal, any boardroom, any victory he'd had in years. And he knew, the danger wasn't in the lie being exposed. It was in how badly he wanted it to become the truth. The next afternoon, Helen was waiting for them with that familiar sparkle in her eyes, the one that always meant she was planning something. As soon as they sat down, she clasped her hands together and said, "I want to hear some of your stories. Real married couple stories. The ones you'll tell your children someday." Lena froze for a second, glancing at Ethan. He met her eyes, and in that silent exchange they both knew there was no polite way to refuse. The rules of their arrangement hadn't accounted for this, weaving an entire past that didn't exist. "Well," Ethan began slowly, "buying time, we met at the pier," Lena interrupted, her voice warm and certain. It was raining. He was standing there, staring at the ocean like it held all the answers. "I thought he was a little lost." Helen chuckled, looking at Ethan. "And were you?" He held Lena's gaze, his answer slower, softer. "Maybe I was." The rest came easier than either of them expected. They took turns layering details, a shared love for late-night walks, an argument over how to make the perfect cup of coffee, a trip they supposedly took to a small coastal village that neither of them had ever visited. Helen listened, laughing in the right places, her eyes shining with happiness. Every so often, Ethan would catch Lena's expression soften in ways that had nothing to do with performance. By the time Helen grew tired, they'd built an entire history between them, one that felt so vivid, Ethan wasn't sure where the lie ended and the truth began. As they tucked the blanket over her and said their goodbyes, Helen held their hands together. "You're lucky to have found each other," she whispered. "Don't ever let go." Walking back to the car, neither of them spoke. The cool evening air wrapped around them, but Ethan felt something warmer, heavier, sitting in his chest. They had just spent an hour telling stories that never happened, and yet, he couldn't shake the feeling that they could have. Maybe even should have. It began as an afterthought. A small detour on the way back from the hospice, justified by a casual, "I know a place you might like." Lena didn't question it, just watched the road as the town gave way to a winding coastal stretch. They stopped at a quiet overlook, the ocean sprawling wide and endless beneath them. Ethan parked and stepped out first, the wind catching his hair, the scent of salt sharp in the air. Lena joined him at the railing, her gaze following the horizon. "Why here?" she asked. He shrugged, though there was nothing careless about his answer. "We said we met at the pier. Thought we should at least make it true in some way." She laughed softly, shaking her head, but she didn't step back. They stood there longer than necessary, the waves crashing below in a rhythm that seemed to drown out the rest of the world. Later, they stopped at a roadside food stand for fish tacos, sitting on a weathered bench with the paper wrappers balanced between them. It was messy and ordinary, the kind of moment that wouldn't make it into any press release, but Ethan caught himself memorizing it anyway. By the time he dropped her at her apartment, it felt like they'd actually lived one of those stories they'd fed Helen earlier. Something small but real. Something theirs. And in the quiet afterward, Ethan realized how dangerous this was becoming. Because every new memory they made blurred the lines more. And the more blurred the lines became, the harder it would be to walk away when the 2 weeks were over. Asterisk. The next morning, Ethan's phone buzzed before the sun was fully up. At first, he ignored it, early calls were rarely good news. But when the buzzing didn't stop, he reached for it and saw a string of messages from his assistant. All with the same link. He clicked it, and there it was. A candid shot of him and Lena at the overlook. The angle was distant but clear enough, Ethan leaning slightly toward her, Lena's hair blown across her face by the wind, both of them framed by the ocean behind them. The caption was simple but loaded, "Ethan Cross and mystery wife spotted on the coast." The article didn't stop there. It speculated about how long they'd been married, why no one had seen her before, whether his absence from the city meant something bigger. By the time he finished reading, the photo had been reposted on half a dozen gossip sites. He called Lena. She answered on the second ring, her voice still groggy. "Is something wrong?" "We've been noticed," he said. There was a pause on the other end. "I thought that was the point." "Not like this," he replied. This isn't controlled. We can't decide how this looks anymore. When he picked her up later that morning, she slid into the car with her phone in hand, the same photo pulled up. You look like you're about to kiss me, she said, her tone light but her eyes searching his face. Would it be so bad if I had? He asked before he could stop himself. She didn't answer, just looked away toward the passing streets. But he noticed the faint color rising in her cheeks, and he knew, with a certainty that unsettled him, that the photo wasn't the only thing neither of them could control anymore. Asterisk. By the following day, the calls started. Investors. Journalists. Old acquaintances he hadn't heard from in years. Each one circling the same subject, carefully or clumsily, his wife. Ethan knew the pattern. Once a story like this gained momentum, it either burned out fast or consumed everything in its path. And if he didn't control it, someone else would. That was how he found himself at Lena's door again, this time not with flowers or a casual invitation, but with a request that would pull her even further into his life. We need to be seen together in the city, he told her. Someplace public. Something that says we're not hiding. Lena leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed. You mean somewhere that says we're real? He didn't flinch. If we don't, the speculation gets worse. And the worse it gets, the harder it is to protect Helen from it. Her expression shifted at the mention of Helen. After a beat, she stepped back to let him in. Where? A gallery opening. Small, controlled crowd. Cameras we can manage. That evening, they walked into a minimalist art space in the heart of the city. It was a different kind of spotlight than the gala, softer, but no less curious. Conversations paused when they entered. Flashbulbs popped. Ethan kept a steady hand at the small of her back, guiding her through the room with practiced ease. Lena played her role flawlessly, but there were moments, between the questions and the photographs, when he caught her smiling at something only he had said, and it felt unpracticed. By the time they left, the city night wrapped around them like velvet, and Ethan realized the line they'd drawn was almost gone. And once it vanished completely, there would be no turning back, not for the story, not for Helen, and not for the two of them. Asterisk. Helen heard about it before they could tell her. When Ethan and Lena arrived at the hospice the next afternoon, she was waiting with a folded newspaper on her lap. The photo from the overlook was printed right there on the front of the lifestyle section, with a smaller shot from the gallery tucked underneath. She didn't say anything at first, just looked at them over the rim of her glasses, a smile tugging at her mouth. You two are becoming quite the talk, she said finally. Lena started to speak, but Helen waved her off. Don't bother explaining. I've been around long enough to know when a couple's in love. And whatever you think you're hiding, it's already written all over your faces. Ethan glanced at Lena, but she kept her eyes on Helen, her expression a careful mix of warmth and restraint. We're just spending more time together lately, she said. Helen's smile deepened. Good. You should. In fact, I have an idea. Her idea turned out to be a weekend at the old Cross family cottage by the lake, a place Ethan hadn't been in years. The hospice had arranged for her to have extra care during that time, and she insisted they go. It'll do you good, she said. Get away from the city. Just the two of you. Ethan wanted to protest, but there was no graceful way to refuse without breaking the illusion. So he agreed. And as they left that day, walking down the corridor in silence, Ethan knew Helen's plan was about more than rest. She was giving them space, the kind of space where pretending would be harder than ever. Asterisk. The lake house sat at the end of a narrow gravel road, hidden by tall pines that swayed in the late summer breeze. It hadn't changed much since Ethan's childhood, the same weathered porch, the same stone chimney, the same faint scent of cedar that greeted them when he unlocked the door. Lena stepped inside first, her eyes moving over the worn furniture, the faded rug, the photographs lining the mantel. She paused at one, a black and white shot of a much younger Helen standing beside a man in a rowboat, both of them laughing like the world belonged to them. That's her, Ethan said quietly, setting their bags down. That's who she still is, in her head. No matter how much time has passed. They spent the afternoon in easy silence, unpacking, exploring the path that wound down to the water, letting the quiet settle around them like a blanket. By evening, Lena was in the small kitchen stirring a pot of soup while Ethan built a fire in the stone hearth. Over dinner, the conversation drifted to Helen again, her stubbornness, her sharp wit, the way she could see through both of them like glass. And then, without quite meaning to, they began talking about themselves. Not the made-up version Helen knew, but slivers of truth. Ethan told her about the first time he saw the lake freeze over, how he thought it meant the world had stopped. Lena shared how she used to walk miles to a public library just to get out of the noise of home. Later, they stood on the porch together, the moon casting silver over the water. The air between them felt different, charged, unguarded. If one of them stepped closer, the space would vanish entirely. But neither did. Not yet. Instead, they stayed there until the chill crept in, the unspoken hanging between them like the mist over the lake, waiting for the right moment to break. Asterisk. The next morning, Lena woke to the sound of soft rain against the roof and the faint creak of floorboards. She followed it into the kitchen, where Ethan stood barefoot, hair mussed, pouring coffee into two mismatched mugs. He looked different like this, not the man in a tailored suit, not the billionaire everyone read about, but someone quieter, stripped of the armor he wore in the city. He glanced up when she entered. "Morning," he said, sliding one of the mugs across the counter toward her. She took it, their fingers brushing for the briefest moment. "You make coffee?" she teased, taking a sip. "Don't sound so shocked." They ended up lingering at the counter, the conversation meandering in the way it only could when there was nowhere else to be. Eventually, Ethan noticed the rain had eased into a light mist. "Come on," he said, grabbing a set of old keys from a hook. Outside, the air was cool and clean, the lake a sheet of rippling silver. He led her to the small boathouse, unlocking it to reveal a weathered rowboat. "When I was a kid," he said, "Helen used to make me take this out before breakfast. Said the water's different in the morning, calmer, like it's still deciding what kind of day to be." They climbed in, their knees nearly touching, the wood creaking under their weight. As they drifted away from shore, the silence between them wasn't empty, it was full, layered with every moment that had brought them here. Halfway across the lake, Lena looked up and caught him watching her. Not the way you look at someone you're pretending to love. Not even the way you look at someone you've decided you might. It was the look of a man who'd forgotten there was ever a line between real and pretend at all. And for the first time, she didn't look away. Asterisk. They stayed out on the water until the mist began to lift, the pale light turning gold at the edges. When they finally returned to the dock, Ethan steadied the boat as Lena stepped out, his hand closing around hers for longer than necessary. Neither mentioned it, but neither let go right away either. Back at the house, they moved through the rest of the day without the usual caution. She helped him chop vegetables for lunch, brushing past him in the narrow kitchen. He found reasons to linger in the doorway while she read by the fire. It wasn't deliberate, this closeness, it just happened, like the house itself was shrinking the space between them. By evening, the rain had returned, steady and insistent against the roof. Power flickered once, then again, before cutting out entirely. The lake house was wrapped in a hush broken only by the fire's crackle. Ethan lit a lantern, its soft glow pooling across the living room. They ate by that light, their knees bumping under the small table. Afterward, Lena drifted to the window, watching the rain blur the glass. "It's peaceful here," she said, her voice low. Ethan came to stand beside her. "It's different when you're not alone." The words hung between them, heavier than the quiet. She turned toward him then, and for a moment, neither moved. His hand came up, brushing a strand of damp hair from her face, his touch slow, deliberate. She could have stepped back. He could have let his hand fall. But neither did. The storm outside swelled, and in that dim, golden light, the line they'd both been guarding for weeks all but disappeared. when they finally kissed, it wasn't rushed or uncertain. It was the inevitable breaking of something they'd both been holding too tightly, for too long. Asterisk. The rain had stopped by morning, leaving the lake still and glassy, the air heavy with the scent of wet pine. Lena stirred first, the thin quilt pulled to her chin, her eyes finding the faint gray light filtering through the curtains. For a moment, she stayed still, listening, to the quiet, to the slow rhythm of his breathing beside her. Ethan was awake, though neither of them spoke. It wasn't the awkward silence of regret. It was the charged stillness of two people who knew the shape of what they'd done and were still deciding what it meant. Eventually, he reached for the clock on the nightstand. "We should head back before noon," he said, his voice even, but softer than usual. Lena nodded, pulling the quilt tighter as he swung his legs over the side of the bed. She watched him stand, watched the way he paused for a second as if he wanted to say more, and then didn't. They moved around the house in quiet cooperation, packing bags, closing windows, making sure the fire was out. It was ordinary, domestic even, and that made it all the more dangerous. On the drive back, the road wound through stretches of forest, sunlight breaking in thin, golden shafts through the trees. Neither spoke much, but every so often their eyes met, a silent acknowledgement passing between them. The kind that didn't need words to carry weight. As the town came back into view, reality slipped in like a draft under the door. There was Helen. There were the questions from the outside world. There was the arrangement they'd both agreed on, the one they had just broken in the most irreversible way. And somewhere beneath all of that was a quieter truth, one neither was ready to voice. Whatever came next, there would be no going back to the way it was before. Asterisk. Helen noticed before they even sat down. When Ethan and Lena walked into her room that afternoon, she studied them the way only she could, not with suspicion, but with the quiet precision of someone who'd been reading people all her life. Ethan went to adjust her pillows, Lena set a small bag of pastries on the table, and Helen's eyes moved between them like she was watching a conversation happen without words. "Something's different," she said finally, breaking the silence. Lena glanced at Ethan, the faintest flicker of nerves crossing her face. "Different how?" Helen's smile was small but certain. "Like you've stopped pretending." Ethan tried to deflect. "We've just been spending more time together." Helen reached for her tea, her gaze never leaving his. "Good. That's what makes a marriage last, time. Not money. Not big gestures. Time." She took a sip, then added, almost casually, "So when are you two going to start thinking about the future?" The question hung there, heavier than the steam curling from her cup. Lena managed a soft laugh. "We're just trying to enjoy the present." Helen tilted her head, her expression knowing. "The present doesn't last forever. And sometimes, you have to decide what you want before time decides for you." Neither of them answered. But as they sat with her, sharing pastries and small talk, Ethan found himself stealing glances at Lena, and each time, the weight of Helen's words settled deeper into his chest. Because she was right. Whatever this was between them, it wasn't pretending anymore. And that meant a decision was coming, whether they were ready or not. Asterisk. The decision Helen spoke of seemed distant that afternoon, something they could both quietly sidestep for a while longer. But life didn't give them that luxury. 2 days later, Ethan's phone erupted with calls before dawn. It wasn't the steady drip of gossip or speculation this time, it was sharper, more urgent. A development deal his company had been negotiating for months had turned into a storm overnight. Environmental groups claimed his project would destroy a protected coastal area. Protesters were already gathering in the city, and the headlines had a new edge: billionaire developer faces public outcry, wife stays silent. By the time he reached Lena, the story had spread everywhere. She was standing in the doorway of the flower shop, phone in hand, her expression caught somewhere between concern and disbelief. "They're using my picture," she said quietly. "From the gallery. From the cafe. They're talking about me like I'm part of this." "That's how they work," Ethan replied, jaw tight. If they can't get to me, they'll come for the people closest to me. Closest, she repeated, the word tasting different now. That afternoon, when they walked into Helen's room, the television was already tuned to the news. The anchor's voice was calm, but the images weren't. Aerial shots of the coastline, footage of shouting crowds, Ethan's face in a split screen beside Lena's. Helen muted the sound but kept her eyes on them. "You two need to decide what you're going to do," she said, her voice steady. "Not for the cameras. For each other." And for the first time since this all began, Ethan realized the truth in her words. Whatever decision they made now would define more than the future of his business, it would define whether this thing between them could survive the weight of the world pressing in. Asterisk. The next morning, Ethan made a choice he wouldn't have considered weeks ago. If Lena was going to be dragged into the scandal by name and image, then she needed to see exactly what his world looked like when it turned on him. He called her before sunrise. "I need you with me today," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. By 9, they were walking through the glass doors of his company's headquarters in the city. The lobby was a cathedral of steel and marble, the air buzzing with tension. Every head turned as they passed, some curious, some skeptical, others calculating the headlines in real time. The boardroom was already full when they arrived. Rows of polished wood, leather chairs, and a view of the skyline that should have felt powerful but today felt like a stage. Lena took the seat beside him, her back straight, her gaze steady even under the weight of a dozen appraising eyes. The meeting began with numbers, legal threats, PR strategies. Then, inevitably, it turned personal. One board member leaned forward, his voice sharp. "This isn't just about the project, Ethan. Your sudden marriage is part of the story now. People are asking questions. They want to know who she is." Ethan didn't hesitate. "She's my wife. That's all they need to know." The room went still for a beat. Lena glanced at him, her eyes searching his face for a hint of performance, but what she saw instead was conviction. Not scripted. Not part of the arrangement. By the time the meeting ended, she understood something she hadn't before. Ethan wasn't just defending her for show. He was defending her because somewhere along the way, she had stopped being a prop in his life and had become part of it. And as they walked out together, side by side, Lena realized the real question wasn't whether she could survive his world, it was whether she wanted to leave it at all. Asterisk. The crisis didn't fade in days, it grew, feeding on headlines, interviews, and speculation. Every hour brought a new twist, an op-ed questioning Ethan's integrity, a panel of talking heads debating whether his marriage was real, a leaked memo suggesting the development would move forward despite the protests. By the end of the week, his legal team had a plan, one that would save the project and quiet the outrage, but at a cost. They wanted Lena to give an interview, to sit under the glare of cameras and smile while answering carefully scripted questions about their life together. When Ethan told her, she didn't answer right away. She just looked at him, eyes steady, as if weighing whether he truly understood what he was asking. "That's not me," she said finally. "I didn't sign up to be a public ornament in your defense." "I know," he replied. "And you won't be." The next morning, instead of going along with the plan, Ethan called a press conference himself. He stood at the podium, Lena watching from the wings, and announced the suspension of the coastal development, effective immediately. He didn't spin it as a business decision. He didn't blame market forces or shifting priorities. He told the truth, that some things mattered more than profit, and this was one of them. When the reporters shouted questions about Lena, he met their eyes and said, "She's not part of this story. She never was. She's the part of my life I won't use as leverage." That night, they drove back to the coast in silence, the road dark and empty between them. Halfway home, Lena spoke, her voice low but certain. "You didn't have to do that." "Yes," he said, glancing at her, "I did." And in that moment, she understood, the sacrifice wasn't just about the project. It was about drawing a line in the sand, a quiet declaration that somewhere along the way, protecting her had become more important than protecting his empire. Asterisk. The days that followed were quieter, as if the storm had passed but left the air different, clearer, sharper. The headlines moved on to the next scandal, the protesters dispersed, and the calls from the board became less frequent. But inside the stillness, something between them had shifted permanently. Lena found herself replaying the image of him at that podium, his voice steady, his words deliberate. It wasn't just what he'd given up, it was the way he'd done it. No expectation of thanks. No bargaining. Just a choice made entirely for her. One evening, as the sun sank low over the water, she stood in Helen's garden waiting for Ethan to arrive. Helen was inside, resting after an unusually long walk, and for the first time Lena realized she was thinking about the future without bracing against it. When Ethan appeared at the gate, there was no pretense in his smile. He walked straight to her, and for a moment they didn't speak, they didn't need to. "You look like you've been thinking," he said. "I have," she admitted. "About how quickly things can change. About how maybe I don't mind it." His brow furrowed slightly, as if trying to read the space between her words. "And what exactly has changed?" She held his gaze, steady and unflinching. "Maybe I'm starting to see what Helen's been seeing all along." He didn't push for more. He just reached for her hand, fingers lacing through hers like it was the most natural thing in the world. And for the first time since they'd started this lie, Lena realized she wasn't thinking about when it would end. She was thinking about what it might look like if it never did. Asterisk. The moment came without warning. One evening, as the tide receded and the last light bled from the horizon, Ethan's phone rang. It was the hospice nurse. Her voice was calm, measured, the kind of tone used when the news was serious but they were trying not to alarm you. Helen had taken a sudden turn. Within 20 minutes, Ethan and Lena were walking quickly down the familiar corridor, the scent of antiseptic sharp in the air. Helen's room was dim, the curtains drawn, the steady beep of a monitor the only sound. She looked smaller somehow, her skin pale against the white sheets, but when her eyes opened, the spark was still there. "There you are," she whispered, her voice thin but certain. "My two favorites." Lena moved to her side, taking her hand gently, and Ethan stood close on the other. Helen's gaze drifted between them, her smile faint but sure. "Don't waste time," she murmured. "Whatever it is you're afraid of, it's never bigger than love." Neither of them spoke, they couldn't. The weight of her words pressed into them like a vow they hadn't made yet but both knew was coming. Helen drifted back to sleep, her breathing slow and even. Outside her room, Ethan leaned against the wall, his head bowed. Lena touched his arm, and when he looked at her, she didn't see the guarded man she'd met weeks ago. She saw someone stripped bare by the fear of losing the one person who had ever truly been home to him. And in that moment, she knew. When the time came, she wouldn't walk away from him, not because of the arrangement, not because of Helen's wish, but because somewhere along the way, she had stopped pretending to. Asterisk. Helen woke the next morning with a clarity that felt different, fragile but deliberate. The nurse had barely left the room when she asked for Ethan and Lena to sit close, one on each side of the bed. Her hands were cool but steady as she took theirs, linking them together over the blanket. "I need to say this while I still can," she began, her voice quiet but carrying the weight of someone who knew there might not be another chance. "I've watched you two from the moment you walked in here. I've seen the way you look at each other when you think no one's paying attention. I've heard the way your voices change when you speak to one another. You may have started this for me, but it's not for me anymore." Lena's throat tightened. Ethan's grip on her hand stayed firm, as if letting go would betray something neither of them wanted to lose. Helen's gaze moved between them, softer now. "Promise me you won't let fear ruin this. Promise me you'll give it a real chance, whatever it takes." There was no hesitation in Ethan's voice when he said, "I promise." Lena's eyes brimmed, but she nodded. "I promise too." Helen smiled faintly, her breathing easing, her eyelids growing heavy. "Good," she whispered. "Then I can rest knowing my boy has finally come home." She drifted into sleep again, leaving them in the quiet hum of the machines, still holding each other's hands. And in that silence, the promises they'd made didn't feel like words for her sake anymore, they felt like the beginning of something neither of them could ever walk away from. Asterisk. The days that followed were a slow, quiet vigil. Helen slept more than she was awake now, her conversations shorter, her voice fading into whispers. The hospice room became their shared world, mornings spent in the soft light spilling through the curtains, evenings wrapped in the muted hum of the machines. Ethan and Lena fell into a rhythm without speaking about it. He brought her coffee exactly the way she liked it, she made sure he ate when his mind was too clouded to think about food. Sometimes they'd sit side by side, not talking, their shoulders brushing as they watched Helen sleep. Other times, they'd trade quiet stories for her sake, even if she wasn't fully awake to hear them. One afternoon, a nurse passed by the doorway and paused, watching them with a small, knowing smile. She didn't see two people pretending. She saw the way Lena would reach for Ethan's hand without thinking, the way his gaze softened when it landed on her, the way they leaned toward each other as though gravity had shifted just for them. And somewhere in the quiet hours between Helen's waking and sleeping, the truth settled over both of them like the weight of a vow already made. They were living like a married couple, not for Helen, not for the world outside, but for themselves. Neither of them dared to say it out loud, but in every glance, every touch, every silent exchange, the promise they had given Helen was already becoming real. Asterisk. It happened on a Sunday morning, the kind where the light comes in softer, as if the day already knows it should be gentle. Helen was awake when they arrived, but there was something different in her eyes, a stillness, a peace that hadn't been there before. She reached for their hands immediately, her fingers curling weakly around theirs. "You kept your promise," she whispered, her gaze moving between them. "I can see it." Lena swallowed hard, fighting the lump in her throat. Ethan's jaw was tight, his thumb brushing over Helen's knuckles as if memorizing the feel of them. Helen's breaths grew slower, each one a little shallower than the last. She spoke again, her words fragile but certain. "You've both given me more than I could have hoped for. You gave me my last wish, and you gave each other a chance. That's all I wanted." Ethan leaned closer. "We love you, Grandma." A faint smile touched her lips. "Then you know everything that matters." Her eyes lingered on them one last time, full of pride, full of the kind of love that asked for nothing in return. Then, with their hands still in hers, she slipped quietly into the space beyond words, beyond the room, beyond the reach of the world. For a long while, they didn't move. The machines were silent, the air heavy with the weight of what had just left them. Lena's tears fell quietly, and Ethan pulled her into him without thinking, holding her as tightly as he'd ever held anyone. In that moment, there was no arrangement, no pretense, no distance left. Only the two of them, bound by the woman who had brought them together, and by the truth neither could hide anymore. Asterisk. The funeral was small, just as Helen had wanted, a scattering of close friends, a few neighbors from her younger days, and the hospice staff who had cared for her like family. The air smelled faintly of lilies and rain-soaked earth, and the lake in the distance rippled under a gray sky. Ethan stood beside Lena through every moment, his hand in hers, steadying her as much as she steadied him. When the final prayer was spoken and the earth was laid over the casket, the world seemed quieter, emptier. Back at the lake house, the silence was almost unbearable. Her laughter, her voice, the small sounds she used to make, all of it was gone. Ethan found himself pacing the living room while Lena sat curled on the couch, staring at the unlit fireplace. Finally, he stopped in front of her. "I don't want this to end here," he said, his voice low but sure. She looked up, her eyes searching his face. "What do you mean?" "I mean, I don't want you to walk away now that Helen's gone. This," he gestured between them, "wasn't just for her anymore. I know that. And I think you do too." Lena's breath caught, and for a moment she didn't answer. Then she rose slowly, closing the space between them until they stood inches apart. "If I stay," she said, "it's because it's real. I can't go back to pretending." Ethan's reply was almost a whisper. "Then let's not." And in that quiet room, with the lake wind pressing softly against the windows, they sealed the promise Helen had drawn from them, not as a performance, not as a duty, but as the truth they had both been walking toward from the very beginning. Asterisk. Ethan didn't announce it right away. For a few weeks, they stayed in the quiet, mornings on the porch with coffee, evenings by the fire, days spent rebuilding life in the absence Helen left behind. But the world beyond the lake didn't forget. The questions about his mystery wife still lingered in headlines, whispered at board meetings, hinted at in carefully worded emails. One Monday morning, as they sat at the kitchen table, Lena glanced at his phone where another message lit the screen: media request, confirmation of marital status. She looked up at him. "You're going to have to answer them eventually." Ethan didn't look away from her when he said, "I know. I just want the answer to be mine, not theirs." 2 weeks later, he walked into a press conference with Lena at his side. There was no prepared statement from his PR team, no scripted talking points. Just the two of them, hand in hand, facing a room full of cameras and questions. When the first reporter asked if the marriage was real, Ethan didn't hesitate. "It's the truest thing in my life," he said. Another asked why they'd kept it so private. "Because it started as something for someone we loved," he answered, his voice steady. "And then it became something for us. We didn't need the world to validate it. But now, I want the world to know she's my wife, not as a cover, not as a convenience, but because I choose her. Every day. For the rest of my life." The room fell into a rare silence, broken only by the shutter clicks of cameras. Lena's fingers tightened around his, and when she turned to look at him, there was no doubt left in either of their eyes. The lie that began as a gift for a dying grandmother had become the truth they would carry forward, not for show, not for anyone else, but for themselves. And as they walked out into the sunlight together, they knew there would be no end to this story, because it had only just begun. Asterisk. They left the press conference without lingering for follow-up questions, stepping into the cool brightness of the afternoon. The noise of the city faded the moment the car door closed, leaving only the quiet hum of the engine and the steady weight of her hand still resting in his. Neither of them spoke on the drive back to the coast. Words felt unnecessary now. The choice had been made, not in front of the cameras, not under the pressure of headlines, but in the weeks and months of moments that had built between them. By the time they reached the lake house, the sun was low, casting the water in bands of gold and rose. Ethan parked, but neither moved to get out right away. Lena looked out at the shimmering surface and said softly, "Helen would have loved this." Ethan's voice was warm when he answered. "She's the reason we're here. The reason we're us." They walked down to the edge of the dock, the boards warm beneath their feet from the day's heat. Standing there, they didn't talk about the past or the questions that might come tomorrow. They simply watched the ripples catch the light, the wind carrying the scent of pine and water, the silence between them deep and certain. Ethan slid his arm around her waist, drawing her closer. "No more pretending," he murmured. Lena leaned into him, her answer quiet but sure. "No more pretending." And in the fading light, with the lake stretching endless before them, they knew the truth had outgrown the lie completely. She had posed as a billionaire's wife to comfort his sick grandmother. But now, she was his wife because they had both chosen it, not for appearances, not for obligation, but for forever. Asterisk. A few weeks later, when the last of summer had begun to give way to the first bite of autumn, Ethan and Lena returned to Helen's garden. The cottage felt different without her, quieter, as if the air itself knew she was gone. But the garden still bloomed. Late roses climbing along the fence, lavender swaying in the breeze, the soil rich from years of her careful tending. Lena knelt by the small patch near the porch where Helen had always said she'd plant one more row of flowers when the time was right. She pressed her hands into the earth, dark soil streaking her fingers, and began placing seedlings in neat lines. Ethan joined her without a word, his large hands working gently beside hers. When they were done, they stood back, dirt on their clothes, sunlight warming their shoulders. The bed wasn't much yet, just green shoots in tidy rows, but Lena could already see it in bloom. Ethan slipped an arm around her. "We'll keep it going," he said quietly. Lena smiled, leaning into him. "Every year." They didn't need to say Helen's name, it was in the air, in the flowers, in the promise they'd just made without ceremony. As they walked back toward the porch, hand in hand, the house no longer felt like a place they were visiting. It felt like home, not because of the walls or the land, but because of the life they were building inside it. Helen had brought them together with a lie. But it was the truth they'd found after that made the love they carried forward something worth keeping alive, season after season, for as long as they both had time to give. Asterisk. She had posed as a billionaire's wife to comfort his sick grandmother, but somewhere between the first handshake and the last goodbye, the pretending had ended, the walls had fallen, and the choice had become theirs alone, to make the love they stumbled into the kind that would last, not for appearances, not for obligation, but for forever.